Welcome to Hanging in My Tree with my third great-grandparents, Alexander Farquhar, Alex, and Jane Dougal. Alex and Jane immigrated from Scotland to Tasmania. They were among the early and mostly Scottish settlers who became known as the pioneers of northeastern Tasmania, Australia. Jane even lived during the Federation of Australia. There are two earlier Hanging in My Tree videos about the immigration bounty system and life in Tasmania, or Van Diemen's Land as it was then known. I recommend that you watch these to understand how wild and hard life would have been at the time. These are the videos about George and Mary Sharman and the video about Lena and William Mercrow. Like the Sharmans, the Farquhars were true settlers shaping Tasmania's past and future. Given the importance of these early settlers, there are lots of stories about the settlement of Scottsdale and the Farquhars, and many of those are shared in this video. So where do they fit in the family tree? Jane and Alexander were the parents of Ellen Sharman, and also Jane was the adopted mother of Lena Mercrow, whom we've seen videos for. Ellen then went on to have a daughter, Laura, who married Cecil, who then had Roy Lang, who then had my father. Alexander was born on 23 June 1828 at Mayboyle, Ayr, Scotland, to David Farquhar and Sarah Dunn. Alex's mother, Sarah Dunn, died when Alex was 8 years old. Jane is reported as being born on the 4th of June 1838 at St Ninians, Stirling, Scotland, to Thomas Dougal and Helen Forfar. Information from family that I've not been able to verify, although has been gathered by individuals who've been researching the family for far longer than me, also suggests that Alex had three older siblings: Robert, born in 1882, James, born in 1825, and Christian, born in 1826. The notes also suggest that Alex's father, grandfather, and great-grandfather were all agricultural labourers and that they lived in the Ayrshire area. A book was written by Alex and Jane's grandson, Robert Alexander Farquhar, and it notes that Alex's parents were farmers, but both died young, and a bachelor uncle took Alex and his brother Robert, or Bob, and raised and educated them, which would mean that the information that I have about Alex's father is wrong. Alex's uncle was reportedly a rich man, as he owned 2 large ships, and when he died, the brothers thought that he would leave them their estate, but he left all of his wealth to a young girl who looked after him during his illness. Disappointed, the 2 boys made arrangements to travel. The girl, on hearing the boys would leave, offered an equal share of her fortune. Being stubborn Scottish men, they would not take charity from a girl. So Alex travelled to Australia and Robert travelled to New Zealand. Family notes also suggest that Jane was the 4th of 8 children, that Jane's father was a master mason and that he had a building business, and that Jane's maternal grandfather was a weaver and employed a number of workers. The 1841 census showed that Jean was living with her grandmother, Isabella Forfar. The 1841 census also shows that Alex was 14 years of age and was living at Mayboyle in Ayrshire, and that he was employed as an agricultural labourer. At the time of the census, he was not living with his family, but he was living with the Jamisons, who were farmers and had a number of other agricultural labourers living there. Jane and Alex were married on 2 December 1856 at St Ninians, Stirling, Scotland, and they travelled to Australia shortly after their marriage on a ship named the Broomielaw. They sailed for Australia less than 3 weeks after their marriage from Glasgow, Scotland. The list of immigrants notes that Jane and Alexander came on a bounty ticket with Catherine Flockhart, James and John Fraser. They were all from Scotland and between 19 to 28 years. Alex was recorded as being 25 years of age and Jane 19. Both were Presbyterian and could read and write. Alex's trade was a ploughman and Jane a housemaid. They arrived in Launceston on 31 March 1859. There were a number of articles about the Broomielaw arriving in Launceston. It was an eventful trip for the newly married couple. The articles indicated things like The Broomielaw entered the Tamar Heads on Tuesday last, having come to an anchor outside the previous day. On the 28th encountered strong gales and heavy beam sea, ship rolling heavily, carried away 4 top gallant masts. On 31st carried away by standing gibbon. On the 13th the ship labouring heavily, carried away 3 topmasts and top gallant masts. 14th, weather moderate, commenced repairing damages. On the 23rd, light airs and calm with heavy swell, ship rolling very heavily, again carried away the main topmast, together with the top gallant mast and royal mast. On the 27th, sent up a new topmast, and at 6 a.m, again on the 28th, set the top mainsail. Margaret, daughter of James Hamilton, died of water in the head, aged 2 years, committed the body to the deep. 20th, carried away 4 topmast studding boom. 23rd, strong breezes, passed a ship, sprung the main topmast and signalled the ship for a new spar, which was obtained by sending out the lifeboat. In taking the boat on board, it got foul, and Charles Anderson and Joseph Quirk, 2 seamen, in leaping out of the boat, fell overboard and were drowned. The fore-tackle block gave way and cut the boat adrift, to ease it from damaging the ship's topsides. 26th, set up the new topmast. 28th, wind taking off suddenly, leaving a highly confused sea. Ship rolling heavily, the head of the main topmast gave way. On the 9th of March, Miss Farquhar's infant died. 20th, sighted Cape Otterway. And at 12 noon on the 30th, the Tamar Light was sighted, distance 6 miles. 5 births occurred on the passage. The newspaper published a testimonial presented to Captain Blythe of the ship Broomielaw by the passengers of Broomielaw, dated the 1st of April 1857. Sir, our voyage now being come to a termination, we cannot think of bidding you farewell without in some way expressing our gratitude we feel towards you. We, sir, believe that the inconvenience attending a long sea voyage has been in great measure ameliorated by the constant kindness you have shown towards us. We have seen you in several of the most trying circumstances that a man in your position can be placed in, when your ship was a partial wreck. The indefatigable energy that you displayed in getting her repaired again and tended greatly to rouse our drooping spirits, and inspire confidence that you would make not only our safe but an expeditious passage through circumstances seemed leagued against you. Combined with your great energy and perseverance, you possess an unassuming kindliness of manner, which is the true characteristic of the British sailor. Believe us, however anxious we may be to get our feet on terra firma, it will be not without feelings of regret that we shall bid you farewell. And in after years, when recalling the scenes that we have witnessed on board of the Broomielaw, you will always be remembered with feelings of respect and gratitude. The passengers arrived on the 31st of March 1857 in Launceston, Tasmania. As part of the bounty system, Jane and Alex were indentured to John Carter for a period of 2 years. The couple had the following children. The unnamed child who was born and died on the 9th of March 1857 on the transport to Australia on the Broomielaw. They had 10 other biological children. Alexander David, Thomas Dougal, Robert William, John Frederick Coote, Albert, Helen or Ellen, Charles, Isabella, David, Alice Mary, and Jane adopted the legitimate daughter of Ellen, Lena. There are handwritten notes by Alex and Jane's son, John Farquhar, who wrote his family history. This included: father came from Glasgow, mother from Bannockburn. Father and mother sailed from Scotland in a sailing vessel, the Broomielaw, landed in Launceston in the year 1857. The Broomielaw made 3 trips from Scotland to Australia. On the 3rd trip going back to Scotland, it was wrecked and went to the bottom of the sea. My parents lived for 2 years in Launceston. My eldest brother Alex was born in Launceston. They came to Scottdale in the year 1859. They made the journey with pack horses. John Cunningham and his wife came through with them, and after getting to what is now Jetsonville, they camped there for a few days. then wandered into the nearby scrub and went down what is now Burnside Road. There they built a large camp. After a short time, they found the thick bush was too heavy to get through and went back to Jetsonville and decided to take up land there, which they did. Father took his pack horses back to Bridgepoint, turned them out on what is now Stevens March, and never saw them again. My second brother Tom was the first child born in Scottsdale in 1859. After settling in Jetsonville, they had to go to Beauwood for their supplies. I'm not sure of the mileage, but it's a long way. Mother and Mrs. Cunningham used to start the day before daylight of a morning for Beauwood for these goods for the home. They always did the journey in one day. After Father had done his day's work, he would go along the road and meet them, often as far as Muddy Creek, to help carry the load home. Mother told us children that when they made it to Muddy Creek, they would take off their boots and stockings and wash their feet in the creek, as they would be bleeding from walking through the heavy sand and carrying the heavy load. They would get home in the evening about 10 p.m, ready for a good night's rest. Jane and Alex's son Robert was born in 1863 in Scottsdale. In 1865, John was born in Burnie. Albert was born in Ringarooma, Tasmania in 1867. Ellen was born in Scottsdale in 1869, Charles in Jetsonville in 1872, Isabella was born in 1873 in Scottsdale, David was born in Ringarooma in 1876, and Alan was born in Ringarooma in 1879. In a number of newspaper articles, Alex and Jane were reported to be the third family of settlers to arrive in Scots New Country, as it was then known. On 23 November 1869, Alexander received a grant of land, 48 acres and 2 roads, in consideration of the sum of around £58. Evidence of his ownership is contained in the grant and the Hobart Town Gazette. The land they owned was in Jetsonville, and their farm was named Bannockburn. Family notes say around 1875, Alex formed a tin mining company named the Great Eastern Tin Mining Company, with a number of other local farmers and business people. This was referred into in a newspaper article in 1928, which confirmed that a meeting of farmers was held at John McBean's house in Jetsonville, and it was decided to form a company consisting of 14 shares for the value of £1 each. Alex was a shareholder, and the company was called the Great Eastern Tin Prospecting Association. 2 good bushmen were sent out to prospect for tin. Those men were Alex and John McBean. After a few weeks, the men returned, discovering what appeared to be good tin in the ground, and a mine manager was appointed. Alexander Farquhar Jr. and other 2 young men were sent to open up the mine. With the mine manager, they made a roomy hut and a rough dam and started to raise tin. Family notes say that the mine was later sold for a good profit. In 1878 and 1879, Alex was successful in a number of tenders for improvements, including improvement of the road from Scottsdale to Upper Ringarooma, a tender for a bridge, forming, logging and slabbing, and improvements of the road between Launceston and Scottsdale. On the 31st of October 1884, Alex passed away, aged 52 years, in Ringarooma, Tasmania. The official records show that Alex died aged 52 years of atrophy of the liver. The newspaper notes that he died after a long and painful illness. A few months later, in December 1884, in the newspaper it was reported that an inquest was held regarding the death of Jane and Alexander's son, Robert William Farquhar. The newspaper notes that he died suddenly a few minutes before midnight. Jane gave evidence that he was 21 years, and on the 18th she observed a light in the kitchen and saw her son John was getting some water for his brother Robert to drink. She went to her son's bedroom and found him sitting on the outside of his bed with his arms resting on his knees and his head in a drooping position. She put her arms around him and asked him what was the matter. He couldn't answer, but raised an eye towards her, then slipped out of her arms onto the floor. 2 of his brothers then lifted him up and lay him on the bed, when after breathing for a few minutes, he died. His features were discoloured and there was froth about his mouth. As soon as he died, his natural colour returned. He had never at any time complained of any pain, nor any declination of his meals. He was of a strong constitution and for the last 9 months had been working on the farm. Previous to that, he'd been working on the roads with a contractor. Thomas, his brother, also gave evidence that he had seen him alive. He was awakened by his brother Robert getting out of bed, and he was making a choking noise in his throat. Thomas assisted him and he never spoke again. His brother John went for a drink, but he did not drink water. He never complained of being sick after smoking. He never smoked much. He did not use intoxicating drinks. John gave corroborative evidence. The water they all used was from a well near the house. The surface water from the cultivated land flows into the well. The water is considered to be good. A post-mortem was taken and there were no external marks on the body except a slight abrasion of the skin below the breastbone. The liver was enlarged with large cysts. Several of the largest cysts were below the heart and appeared to be pressing on the thorax and the heart, obstructing respiration and producing paralysis of the heart, which would account for the sudden death. The use of well water into which the droppings of cattle and dogs find their way might be a primary cause of such a disease. A witness thought this may be the case after having heard that whilst working on the road, the water used by the deceased was of the most impure character. The jury gave a verdict the death was from the enlargement of the liver pressing on the thorax and heart, produced paralysis of the latter organ. Robert was among one of the first-born children in Scottsdale and our first Sabbath school pupils. He was universally respected as highly esteemed, and 2,000 to 3,000 people paid respect at his funeral in the Scottsdale private cemetery. Robert's death notice says, "We miss him. Oh, we miss him. We miss him everywhere we look in his accustomed place. Alas, he is not there." On 23 December 1884, probate for Alex's estate to the value of £210 was granted to Jane Farquhar, Robert Brands, and Ernest Hazelwood Bonner. In 1887, Jane adopted as her daughter Elena or Lena. I have to make a correction from an earlier video about Elena Murcrow. In that video, I said that both Alexander and Jane adopted Lena as their own child, but by the time of Lena's birth, Alex had been deceased for 3 years. 2 of Jane's other children predeceased her, Alexander David on the 7th of May 1990 and Alice in 1908. Jane saw the Federation of Australia in 1901, which is when the 6 independent governing British colonies, New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, South Australia, Western Australia and Tasmania, unified into the Commonwealth of Australia. There are a number of articles in the newspaper that chronicled the history of the pioneers in Scottsdale. I should be clear that the settlers were not the first inhabitants of Australia or Tasmania. Our Indigenous Aboriginal population had lived on the land for tens of thousands of years. While seen as savages and displaced from their homes, the complexity of our Indigenous people were not recognised or understood by the settlers and pioneers at that time. Even the fact that originally Jane and Alex's son was reported to be the first boy born in Scottsdale demonstrates lack of understanding or consideration of the native inhabitants of the land. Back to the articles about the pioneers' history. In 1909, it was reported that it was now 50 years ago since one of the most fertile parts of Tasmania was first discovered by the late Mr. Scott and settled upon by the earliest pioneer settlers. It is well known that the life of the early pioneers of this or any other out-of-the-way new country is truly a hard one. As far as hearsay goes, the first fruit garden was laid out by John Cunningham and Alex Farquhar, known as Studer's Block, adjoining Burnside Road. This is where Cunningham and Farquhar erected their first bush home in New Scots country. Both these settlers were obliged to leave their young wives and families for a little while, at least, while they returned to what was then called up country, so as to earn money to keep things going on their new selection. While the two men were away earning money that was then much needed, Mrs. Cunningham and Mrs. Farquhar both lived together for the sake of enjoying each other's company in the dense and lonely bush. In 1910, an article looks back on the last decade in Scottsdale. Many of those that were with us when the Commonwealth of Australia was launched 10 years ago have long since gone. This reminds us of how few of the pioneer settlers that worked hard in the early days of settlement to open up this dense forest are still with us today. Just let's look back 40 or 50 years ago. How few there are of those who arrived and then selected land and commenced to clear away the dense bush and fell the great trees so as to erect their first bush homes. If I remember rightly, there are some not more than 20 to 30 still in the flesh living today, including Mrs. Jane Farquhar. In 1912, there was an article that spoke about how Christmas 50 years ago, there arrived in Scots New Country, since named Scottsdale, about 90 to 20 families of the first pioneers to select land and settle in the district, including Alex Farquhar, and that Jane Farquhar is still living in the district. It is pleasing to note that the first two white children born in the northeastern district are still alive and well. I refer to Mr. Thomas Farquhar and Miss A. Darling of Launceston. In 1914, Jane was reported as living at George Street, Scottsdale, and doing domestic duties. Jane died aged 80 at her home on 4 November 1918 in Scottsdale, Tasmania. She was buried at Scottsdale and Ellesmere General Cemetery. Before I finish this video, I want to share a few more reports of what life was really like for Jane and Alex. In a newspaper article dated the 6th of February 1923, it reports, when the first settlers came to the district, none of them had previously seen heavy scrub bushland, and there was no one to tell them the best and cheapest way of opening up their holdings. Each one just did what he thought was best. Instead of newcomers setting to work felling the bush, each selector only felled a few acres of bush each year, and very few acres at that. And then after the burn-off, they would spend no end time in clearing these very few acres like a flower garden, excepting for the big logs. They would chip with the hoe when all hands would most likely be negated on the job, and very slow and hard work it was, especially chipping among the roots of the blackwoods and the old man ferns. Robert, Jane and Alexander's grandson, also reports that at Bannockburn all crops were chipped with the hoe, and harvest was taken by reap hooks, and as long-standing timbers were too numerous for the ploughs. Alex had several teams of horses, and it was Robert's view that his grandfather Alex was a powerful man who did a lot of heavy work, but overdid his strength and died in 1885. Going back to the article, it says, one thing the little farmer could always make sure of, and that was reaping a good crop of grain, or at any rate a good crop of straw, as sometimes his wheat would grow up a heavy crop and then take the blight or rust, when the crop would turn out a failure and all his hard work for the season would be for nothing. But should his crop miss the rust and blight, then he could expect a good yield of wheat. This wheat, when harvested, would then have to be threaded with a stick and a half called a flail, or beaten out over the edge of a barrel, cut in half, and the wheat was thrashed against the inside of the tub. There was so much rain in those early days before the district was opened out that the wheat was often very dark brown in colour, and when carried to Bridport and shipped to Launceston would not realise a very high price. If my memory served me correctly, on the season the wheat only brought as low as 1 shilling per bushel, sold as fowl's feed, so that farming under these early conditions was certainly not profitable at all. Later on, the little cockies became wise in their generation, and instead of chipping in all of their crops with hoes, they would harrow them in, and they did really well on the newly burnt off ground. For years after the district opened, there was no shop or general store. It was about the year of 1869 that gold was discovered at Waterhouse, 20 odd miles from Scottsdale. Soon after the discovery, claims were pegged out in all directions, and mining people flocked over there from all over Australia. A newspaper article in 1923 reports, "The first settlers got few provisions occasionally, as there was no store of any description in the new settlement. From the earliest days of settlement, nearly everyone spent one day of the year, Boxing Day, at Bridport. The first sports I remember were held on Christmas afternoon, and the great event of the day was catching the pig with the greasy tail." In 1927, there is a comprehensive history of Tasmania's northeast. The late John McBean and the late Alexander Farquhar had a contract on the road through Ellesmere from Tucker's Corner to the Brid River. The roads in those days were simply dreadful, partly owing to the great cart traffic to the Lyles goldfield. In January 1933, there is an article about how Scottsdale has progressed in 70 years. 70 years ago, the only road was a cart track cut through the dense forest, only just wide enough to let dray pans pass. Now there are beautiful metal roads everywhere. Then you could not see 5 chains through the thick bush scrub. Today you can stand on any hill and look out at tens of thousands of acres of rolling hills and valleys, covered with crops and abundance of splendid pastures of the richest descriptions. We are 40 miles from the city of Launceston. The town has a good water supply from the Brid River, which never runs dry. The town of Scottsdale is 12 miles from the sea at Bridgepoint. 72 years ago, there was born to Jane and Alex their second son, whom they named Thomas Davis. He was the first white child born in the newly discovered district of Scottsdale, or Scots New Country. Thomas David Farquhar first saw light on the erection next to the portion of land on which he now lives on Burnside Road, and so our firstborn still lives amongst us, and his only problem is that he is getting old early. The last article I want to talk to you about is one from 1935 that talked about the dense forest land of northeast Tasmania that was unknown until 1855, when James Scott set out to explore the section of the state on behalf of the government. When he returned to Launceston, he told stories of prime land, a wonderful belt of land that he had discovered, and the good news spread like wildfire. Shortly after, men began to come into the settlement, including Alexander Farquhar. All of the settlers were Englishmen, Scotland, or Irishmen. The district of Jetsonville was settled first because the pioneers came from the coast. There were no roads in those early days, and only a cart track wide, just enough to allow a dray to squeeze through the standing bush timbers existed. As each settler wished to get his block, he had to extend the bush road to his selection. There were many difficulties to overcome in those days on the northeast, when a home and living had to be carved out from a thick bush. But the pioneers were a sturdy crowd, and although food was very scarce, there is no record of any farmers having starved to death. The united efforts of whole families and the help of neighbours were brought in to help clearing the farms and building homes, and gradually progress was made, slowly at first, with an assurance of ultimate success. About 1855, the government called for tenders for the scrubbing, felling, grabbing and clearing of the first roads from Bridpoint to Tucker's Corner, Scottsdale, a distance of about 13 miles. The first water scheme in Scottsdale was not set up until 1907, when a water wheel was used. The first government school was opened in the old Union Chapel at Ellesmere. The day the school opened, 42 children attended. There was no hospital until 1920. Thank you for watching this video of Hanging in My Tree about Jane and Alex Farquhar, the difficult life they had setting up their farm and raising their children. I also want to thank the family members who provided me with information and research that they had done on Jane and Alexander and other members of the family. Like all other videos, this has been done for family history purposes, so it contains information directly quoted from the internet and photos that have been obtained from sources on the internet as well. Thank you for listening.